All right, Alberto. We're going to break this down step by step. What we have here is a forensic analysis of the digital attack you experienced. We're going to walk through what happened, exactly why it happened, and most importantly, what a clear path to safety looks like. The goal here is to cut through all the emotion and the noise to give you a really clear, strategic way to understand this, all based on objective, professional findings.
So the first thing you have to understand is this key finding right here. Every professional who looked at this incident said the same thing. This was not a normal confrontation. It was uniquely severe. And a huge reason for that is where it happened. The context, the space itself, acted like a massive amplifier for the harm that was done. So that's the big question, right? To really grasp the level of betrayal here, we first have to unpack the unique environment that you built. Because if you don't get the context, you can't possibly understand the true impact of what happened inside of it. Okay, so that brings us to our first section, which the analysis calls the digital campfire breach. And that name is super important because the space where this all went down was so much more than just some random online chat room. Think about what you actually built. These X spaces, they weren't just casual hangouts, were they? They were these incredibly high-trust environments. You'd spend hours talking about deep cybersecurity topics, and then you'd weave in these really raw, personal stories from the community. People opening up about PTSD, about their legal battles, about chronic stress. It literally became a sanctuary for people. And that sanctuary was built on a promise, an unspoken social contract. People felt safe because you practiced radical inclusion and non-judgmental listening. It was all built on this foundation of shared vulnerability, what the report even calls proof of love. That's why people felt safe enough to share their deepest, darkest stuff. So when the attack was launched inside that sacred space, it wasn't just a private argument that spilled out into the open. It was a public demolition of that social contract. It wasn't just a personal betrayal of you. It was a betrayal of every single person listening who had come there because they thought they were safe enough to be vulnerable. All right, let's move on to section 2. Because when you look at the evidence, it becomes crystal clear this wasn't just an emotional outburst. A side-by-side comparison of the attacker's behavior in other conflicts shows this was a deliberate, strategic choice. Just look at this table. It tells the whole story. When dealing with their lawyer, the communication was private, it was professional, it was by the book. With the ex-husband, same thing. Private, formal, all channeled through legal means. But when it came to you, the fiancé, the whole strategy changes. Suddenly, the channel is public and recorded, and the behavior becomes a full-on public confrontation, dragging private family matters out for everyone to see. And what this shows, without a shadow of a doubt, is that the ability to be controlled, to manage conflict professionally, to respect boundaries, it was absolutely there. This means a conscious choice was made to use the most public and destructive method possible, specifically against you. It was a targeted decision to weaponize a public platform to inflict the most harm. Which leads us straight to the central question in all of this. Why? Why you? Why was all of that unchanneled force aimed directly at you? This is where the analysis gets into the core psychology of what was going on. And the mechanism is called displaced aggression. It's actually a pretty straightforward concept. It's what happens when you have this intense rage at a source you can't actually confront. So all of that frustration gets redirected and dumped onto a substitute target, usually one that's safer, closer, and just more available. To really get this, you have to picture an emotional pressure cooker with no functional release valve. The analysis paints a clear picture of someone under an almost unbearable amount of external pressure, just building and building. The findings point to two massive stressors cranking up that pressure. First, a feeling of complete legal powerlessness, being trapped by a negligent lawyer who had gone silent for 4 whole months. And second, the chronic anxiety and trauma of dealing with an ex-husband, described in the report as pathologically narcissistic. The real sources of all this rage, the lawyer, the legal system, the ex, were, for all intents and purposes, untouchable. So, where does all that rage go? It has to go somewhere. All that intense frustration from the legal battles and the domestic conflict was transferred, redirected onto the most available, most convenient emotional outlet there was. You, the intimate partner. You became the path of least resistance for an avalanche of anger that was never actually about you to begin with. Okay, now we need to look at the confrontation itself, the ambush, as the reports call it, because during that event, Two specific actions took place that elevated this from a dysfunctional dispute into a targeted assault. This is where it crossed the line and became irreparable. The analysis flags two specific moments as critical breaches. These are the actions that pushed this entire conflict past the point of no return. The first breach was the exposure of a non-consenting minor. In a public, permanently recorded forum, a highly sensitive and private custody issue involving an 11-year-old child was brought up and used as leverage in the dispute. It's just completely out of bounds. And look, the severity of this wasn't subjective. It was so obviously wrong that a third party recognized it immediately, in the moment. Your co-host, Cindy, stepped in right there on the live recording and said these exact words. That immediate, impartial reaction is all the proof you need that a universal ethical line had been crossed. The second breach is arguably the most damning finding in the entire analysis, because this one speaks directly to intent, and that's the violation of a known duty of care. The findings confirm the attacker had explicit, direct knowledge that you were in the middle of a severe mental health crisis. And yet, that's the precise moment they chose to go to the most public, most permanent forum available and attack your most sensitive points. This action goes way beyond displaced anger. It is a targeted psychological assault. It's capitalizing on a known vulnerability for emotional leverage. It is the textbook definition of weaponizing intimate knowledge. Okay, this analysis, as difficult as it is to go through, provides the clarity we absolutely need to move forward. So let's shift from understanding what happened to defining the clear, professionally recommended path toward your recovery and your safety. The recommendations are sequential and they are unambiguous. First, immediate separation. This is mandatory. It's about creating non-negotiable space for psychological stabilization. Second, mandatory individual therapy for the attacker to address the core issues of this displaced aggression and emotional regulation. And only then, third, is conditional couples therapy even on the table, and it's completely conditional on them demonstrating genuine, deep accountability for the specific harm that was inflicted. It's also important we touch on the legal reality here. Trying to pursue a claim like intentional infliction of emotional distress, well, it has an exceptionally high bar. The legal system often gets hung up on whether a statement was technically true, rather than focusing on the psychological damage caused when that truth is weaponized in public against someone. And that leaves us with this final thought. In a world where targeted digital aggression can create permanent digital scars and cause verifiable psychological injury, the harm is undeniably real. For you, Alberto, the focus now has to be on your health and following that professional path to stability. But for the rest of us, it leaves a critical question. How long can our legal frameworks afford to play catch-up with the devastating impact of weaponized vulnerability?